Hi, everybody. We're back with another episode of Practically Platonic. I'm here with my good friend, Jeff. Hey, Jeff, how are you doing?
Good. How are you? Thanks.
Pretty good. So today we're going to be talking about chapter 3.6. Also, it was chapter 26 in the original order of things on the impassibility of things without bodies. So the chapter deals with the Platonic, Neoplatonic physics of matter and the metaphysics of being, the physics of change or affection, as he calls it, and the cause of the visible universe, and the rationale for the existence of vice in ensouled beings. Like much of his work, it's in part a gloss on the works of Plato. In this case, he cites the Timaeus in arguing for his interpretation of the text against an unnamed opposition. I'm not sure if you picked up on who he was arguing with, but I did notice that, but he never named them. And that they hold a different interpretation on some of the passages of the Timaeus. Referring to and interpreting the Timaeus, he delves into the nature and existence of what we would consider now the visible universe. He backs into his initial logical assertion that alteration or change can only occur through the interaction of two or more non-identical things. So two things that are identical obviously are not going to change each other. At least one of the two things or multiple things has to be in some way different. He states that the universe is visible only due to the reflection of being onto matter, creating the image that we perceive as reality. But the visible universe, much like images in a mirror, are not substantially real. And even more false are they in this universe of images, because at least the mirror in the metaphor is visible even when nothing is reflecting in it, unlike his description of matter as he understands it, which is not visible to the eye at all. So he spends much of the chapter trying to explain and describe how this interaction takes place, and yet how being, or the forms, never in any way actually mix or are affected by non-being, matter, or vice versa. He takes some time to discuss the nature of magnitude and the correlation of size and the illusion of size in the visible universe. These arguments are also the basis for his theories on why ensouled beings, like you and I, can have vice, even if the soul can never be affected by matter. The origin or the very essence of evil being matter. To that end, he states poignantly, that which is involved with sense perception belongs to a soul that is asleep, as much as part of the soul that is in a body is asleep. Therefore, almost as if everything we perceive as the visible universe and reality is almost like a dream, as we experience dreams, as these images, these illusions that maybe are projections from some real reality, right? Like in us, it would be our consciousness. Perhaps we don't really know that much about dreams, but I think that's kind of what he's making as a metaphor. So this is a pretty long chapter, and I try to just explain it to some degree chronologically, but let's just get into it and discuss different aspects as they come up. But those are basically the main concepts that he goes over again and again and tries to explain from different perspectives. So, Jeff, what are your thoughts on this chapter, or anything you'd like to start off with?
Well, the first thing I'd like to start off with is the quote that caught my eye on page 311 in the English translation. For whenever we say that the soul is moved in its appetites, acts of calculative reasoning, when believes, we don't mean that it does these things by being shaken. Rather, we mean that these motions arise from it. That is to say that it's actually not external factors, namely, for example, matter, that shake the soul, but rather all sorts of motions that occur within the soul are caused by the soul itself. And this ties in with this whole idea that it's actually not the soul being affected by matter at all, but it's rather the soul's own impressions and relationship with matter, which is non-existent, which is incorporeal, and has the same state as an image in a mirror. And so there actually is no direct effect of matter on the soul. And he makes a point in this chapter too, that if matter could actually interact with the soul, if it actually could mix and mesh and integrate itself into the forms, then it would take a part of the good and it would no longer be evil.
All
And
right.
so we'd be left with a sort of contradiction there where matter could embrace the good, but in fact it cannot because it's incorporeal and it doesn't exist, but it's also the source of all of our vices. So the takeaway from that is that if we understand this, then we can understand that whatever sort of affections, afflictions, sort of internal torments we have, it's a result of our own souls. It's actually not the matter itself that's causing this, but rather it is emotions within our own souls. So it's effectively a challenge or maybe a call for the reader to consider how we approach matter, because in ordinary life, when we relate to things in the material world, whether it be objects of, sexual or culinary desire, or even abstract things such as social status, which are inevitably connected with matter into varying degrees. This is entirely our own internal making. It's not the matter itself that's affecting us.
Right. And I think he tries to kind of explain that by saying that that basically evil, or not evil, but vice is caused by the soul either turning toward the intellect, and therefore reason, basically that when we're turned inward and reasoning, that is virtue. And when the soul chooses to look away from the intelligible realm or being, and I assume gaze upon the image of matter, and it buys into the irrationality. So it's not actually that matter is directly, like you said, influencing it, but it's the soul's own choice of how it's orienting itself. So it's never actually in a physical, or even, I don't know if I would say that it's not metaphysically interacting with it, but it is perceiving the matter. And when we become deluded into thinking that that is something real, that is irrationality, right? That was my interpretation of that passage. And he says that true seeing is the direct transfer of intellect into the cognitive soul. So that's like pure reason, right? So that kind of made me think of an example like the pure mathematics. I would assume that that would be like a good example of something that he might agree is true reason that comes directly from the intelligible realm, versus the opposite of giving into, say, the despair and agony of a physical affliction, where we're totally focused on the pain we're experiencing caused by our nervous, the pain being caused by the matter aspect of our nervous system, our, the chemistry in our brain causing the emotions, et cetera, et cetera. It's two complete opposites, right? Not that, I mean, that's just one more just a kind of amoral concept that came to me. Was pure maths is one of the few things I can think of in the academic world, or in the world of knowing as we know it, that seems to be come completely from the intelligible world, because there is no physical aspect to it. But yeah, basically it's just how the soul in us chooses to turn.
Right. And as a result of the way we orient ourselves, as you're saying, this is also the source of evil. And so in 362 on page 308 in the translation, the first paragraph says, "First, concerning vice and virtue, we must say what exactly happens when vice is said to be present in the soul. For we do talk about having to remove evil, as though there were some evil present in the soul, and put in virtue, order it, and instill beauty in place of the ugliness that was previously present." So this is, again, a sort of call to consider a, therapeutic process where you can remove the evil in the soul. Although, we have to be cautious, because it's not that the soul was somehow infected or tainted by matter, but rather it's just the soul's orientation toward that matter. And so the whole process of reorienting the mind toward the good, towards the forms, away from matter, and also, I guess, recalibrating our value system so that we don't have so much emotionally and mentally invested in matter, and from and as a result of that, the natural outcome will be a reduction in vice, and then there will be, harmony in that place. It kind of, I mean, it brings to mind how, for example, in Stoicism, there's this idea that effectively that, pain is natural, but the suffering is optional.
Right.
So even if you do experience, hardships and horrible things, it really just depends on your orientation toward those things. And that will determine whether you just, I guess, observe these things from afar or observe them. Well, you can observe them directly, but how you interpret them will determine your emotional reaction.
Right. So going back to the fact that vice is only possible when the soul is turned toward or contemplating, I guess, matter, I think we need to make the point that, though, it's not just matter itself is not seeable or viewable. It's really, and I think he talks about it early in the chapter, how being in some way, it doesn't really enter into matter, but bodies are kind of a mix of matter and being together, because matter deprived of any illumination from being would be nothing. So what's really even possible, the reason that the soul can even perceive matter, what it's really perceiving is the image of being, which is a corrupted version of true being. I guess
Right.
that's just a detail, but I think it's important because going into like his metaphysics, his physics of how this works, like the soul can't really perceive matter because it doesn't exist. What it's really perceiving is this image, because, and I think that's important to point out because he keeps on iterating how it's not actually affected by matter, it's not actually mixing with matter. It's not even really like perceiving matter. It's really just perceiving this corrupted image from being, which precedes soul anyways. So,
and assuming that the coarse image, which is matter, the coarse reflection of the forms is good, that it's worth pursuing, that it's worth acquiring these things and interacting with it. So, but then there's, I guess, a sort of practical aspect too. I wonder is how easy is it to orient yourself away from matter? I mean, that's the challenge, especially when, as living beings, we still have to take care of ourselves. But I think really what he's talking about is how to orient yourself so that you're not mentally afflicted by vice. And by vice, he means things like excessive appetite. He doesn't mean like you have to stop eating or wanting to feed yourself, but rather just excessive things that cause all sorts of irrational behavior, self-destructive and harmful behaviors toward others. And so this is how we remedy these problems, this vice in ourselves, by having a proper view. And from the proper view of matter, naturally vice will fall away.
Right. I mean, and I think he kind of says at a certain point something that sounds very Stoic to me. Where was it that he said it? He says something about just not that we need to turn inward, that we need to not to basically to purify the soul is to remain uninfluenced and unaffected by the illusions presented to us in the, he doesn't say the visible universe, but this is me just paraphrasing. But basically, to purify your soul, which I think is not the same as the Stoic concept, but comes close enough to like live a serene or enlightened life, is to be able to turn away from that and perceive that it is all illusion, which I think to some degree, as the example you gave, is the underlying concept that the Stoics have. Pain might be really happening to your physical body, but the emotional reaction is an option because it's not, none of it's really real. So yes, I think what he's pointing out, that a tool that one might have is to constantly be able to want to know and to remind oneself as kind of as a practice in life, that many of the things that maybe before this knowledge we thought were important are in fact not important, and that everything is much more morphable than we think. Things are not really absolute. The things we perceive as reality are not absolutes. They're just mutable images. That includes our situations, our perceived good or evil of pleasures or pains, other people, the things we think we want, all of these things, even material things we might want to purchase or attain. If we're constantly reminding ourselves, fundamentally, what really matters in my life are these other things that society or I myself might be giving so much value to, are they actually that valuable? Are they even really real? And how do they how are they really good or bad? And how are they really affecting my soul and my morality? Which fundamentally, if you buy into this idea, if you're not a hedonist, that's what matters. Like the good or happiness is tied to living a moral life filled with truth, and these things are not truth.
Right.
They're the
That's a very good point. So if we orient ourselves toward truth, then we will orient ourselves towards what's actually real, what's actually true,
Yeah,
which is the forms, not matter. And so
right.
when we look at matter, we're not actually even perceiving. We think we're perceiving matter, but what we're just looking at is crude images,
Right.
crude reflections of the forms. But then we mistake that for something much more substantial. And kind of building on this, on page 330, he says matter does not give birth to anything.
Right.
So again, we're often emotionally invested in our material things, and then that just leads to all sorts of to use Buddhist terminology, attachments. And I think Plotinus would have, accepted that sort of idea as well. And so as a result of that, we're inevitably compelled out of desire for various things. So here's a question. Here's a question though. Like if we're talking about abstractions within the material world, like social status, how would you formulate that in this theoretical framework? Because social status is an abstraction that
Right.
is not, strictly speaking, matter. You can't see social status, you can't perceive it, but it is definitely something that.
But it does have other physical, I guess you could say, ramifications. Social status might be so I think, like, first of all, social status is the perception you have of whoever this person that has social status is, and everyone else's perception of that person. And that false perception that is not important, this is Sylvia speaking, I think that's coming from parts of the physiological human, the chemistry in the brain, the aspects that make us function as animals here. Much like animals, in a sense, have their own social status, right? They have a social structure. I think that those feelings we have around that are all kind of from not really from our reptile brain, but like it's the physical part of the human. It's not the ascended soul that is in us, or the in soul, the higher part of the soul. So I think the feelings of superiority the person of status might feel, or the feeling of inferiority others might, or envy that others might feel, or the desire to be them, is all tied to bioevolutionary things that we have that have been now extrapolated to kind of some things that might be perceived as frivolous, just due to the social complexity of a human, right? If we were a mere animal such as wolves or something like that, it would be much more simple. Like maybe the alpha male and female, they get more of the meat, even though they may not have done all of the hunting. So the other animals, even though they are afraid to do anything because of the social structure, they would be, I guess, envious or wish they could have some of that meat to eat more. Obviously, we're much more complex than this, and it turns into these desires and these envies for things. But I think fundamentally, on the ground level, it's just bioevolutionary impetus that is tied to brain chemistry, hormone, all the stuff that's just part of the material world, that is part of the visible universe.
Mhm.
So that, I think, is one. And two, those abstractions that we think about, that come with status will be things like money, being treated a certain way by people. But all of these things that they end up attaining, it's just because humans are reacting with their base emotions or the way that we're like hardwired in the physical world. That has nothing to do with reason, right? Because if like think about like if reason was dictating things, people who are teaching or people who are doing good medical work would be making more money than a soccer player. But it's not reason that is dictating this. They'd have more status, but than a celebrity on a reality TV show. But that is in fact not how things are in the modern world. So clearly it is not dictated by reason. Obviously not every individual sees it that way, but like in the zeitgeist, if there's some actor or celebrity walking by, people are going to get way more excited and perceive that person as a person of status more than if a surgeon who saved people's lives were to walk by and you even find out that that's what he does.
Right. So social status also as you're saying, also confers material benefits as well. So material goods and also security, or at least the perception of it. So, but I guess I'm wondering, what I'm ultimately getting at is
it's a deviation of like aspects that are not part of the intelligible realm. It's a reaction based on, I don't want to say matter because matter is nothing, but you know, that which exists here as matter, like our all these things that are not part of reason. They're just deviations on the bioevolutionary necessities that exist in beings that are enmeshed in matter. That's why I think social status is also an illusion, because it's coming from these animal instincts to describe it, to give it a term that is very, very simplistic.
Right. And also, evolutionary biology is different from what Neoplatonic thinkers were thinking. So in this case, the soul is being stirred and shaken by a conception that it has internally, not externally, because social status does not actually, strictly speaking, exist. It's a perception. It's an idea that we formulate based on a galaxy of factors, external and primarily external to us, like how do other people perceive us? How do we perceive other people in a social hierarchy? And so,
but the things that are influencing it, that's what I'm getting at. It's like, it's not from using pure reason. It's from being influenced by these aspects of matter, which he did not know about. He didn't know about bioevolutionary factors or all of this. But I think he was still kind of like the direction he was going still broadly could fall into the general description he's giving, where it's the soul is turned or allowing itself to focus on certain things. And in this sense, we could extrapolate as we are succumbing to the physiological impulses that we've physically evolved to have. And our higher self, which is not of this body, is allowing that to continue, is allowing to feed into that and focusing on that.
But so if the outcome is that if you honestly perceived, if you truly perceived the non-existence of matter and you oriented yourself toward the intelligible realm, then what kind of person would you be in a social setting?
Probably more boring.
Probably more boring. You'd be a true philosopher.
I don't know but so I think this stuff is actually applicable. Like I try to apply it to my life, and I even in stupid little things, but I think that's what life is. It's a bunch of small details. Like even something as banal as going to the store, I did this the other day. I went to some Home Goods, which is a store here that has a bunch of stuff for your house, and it's very colorful and it has all sorts of cool stuff that you really don't need. And I kept on picking things up that I thought, and like I could feel like if you stop and if you're mindful, you recognize that like the rationalization you're giving yourself is being caused by emotional impulse, and that emotional impulse is like the addictive, the animal instinct in us that has been taken advantage of by modernity to have like kind of an addictive quality, right? Like to want more of things. I'm like, do I really need this new set of sheets when I already have like 7 of them? And I guess what I'm getting at is, once you become aware and learn and truly believe that the material is illusion to a certain degree, and that yes, we exist here, we need to take care of ourselves, and we need to have some level of moderate level of things, but we don't need excess. And if you are aware of that and you choose to be contemplative and exercise this in your life, and you become a mindful person, and actually that's how you can like put this into practice. Just knowing it isn't enough. You need to constantly be reiterating to yourself, in a sense. And that's not by repeating a mantra necessarily. It's by, in your choices in life, stopping and thinking, why am I doing this? Being contemplative in your choices, which I think is what wise people or people who are trying to mature as individuals psychologically. I mean, isn't that the difference between a mature adult and maybe a child? Small children just react to things. Someone who has matured stops and thinks before acting. And that, I think, can also apply to all of these things that he's talking about that are illusion, be it wanting to purchase things, more material gain, envy of others, anger towards situations, feelings of despair or anxiety. And anyways, I left the store having put everything down. I didn't end up buying anything because I didn't really need any of these things.
Right. So basically, what we're talking about is that if you have a proper orientation, then probably your spending habits will change.
Yeah.
Also, because, like you said, you realize that you're being, how do you say, encouraged by effectively, desire, maybe even a touch of vanity to, or maybe it's also the belief that if you purchase more of these things, that somehow your home will just feel more comfortable, even though.
Yeah, but it's also just giving into like a base desire to push that that endorphin button, or that some of the other hormones that are not coming to mind right now, but the ones that the pleasure hormones. I mean, just like if you have a dog or a cat, unless they're picky eaters, like if you give them more food, they will eat it until they get sick or fat, because they don't really have, as far as we know, they don't have this level of contemplative self-awareness and restraint.
Right. I mean, if I think about my own life, I mean, I was talking to a friend about this recently, that I'm basically over the last 20 years, so I'm 39 this year. So basically for the last 20 years of basically my adult life, I've more or less maintained the same standard of living. I just wear simple clothes. I don't really buy many luxury goods. I've never smoked. I've never done drugs, never smoked weed, never even owned a car. And there's a sort of rationale behind that. It's not like frugality as a result of fearing poverty. So even when I haven't had money versus when I've had money, I've had the same mindset, where that if I don't purchase all these things and I don't weigh myself down with unnecessary material things, then I can direct myself toward what I feel to be more important things. And it's also like time as well. So
but
the
I think
amount of
that's
time,
because you entered a kind of philosophical life very early in your life. I mean, I know we talked a little bit about our background at the beginning of this podcast, but you basically started studying Buddhism and were even a Buddhist monk in your 20s, correct?
yes.
Yeah. So like, and I think these concepts so basically what I think this chapter is about is he's presenting his physics rules to how this works, but when it comes to lifestyle and morality, this is something that we see again and again in different schools of thought and different religions. This asceticism toward the illusion of material. I think it doesn't, like in practice, it doesn't vary that much in the kind of Buddhism you're practicing at the time, or your practice of Stoicism. It comes back again and again because I think it is a universal truth. So you have this lifestyle because the things that I've started doing the last couple of years, you've been doing for a long time. And like, I gave a very silly example because I like to give very relatable, silly, like that, like things like the way you start living a philosophical life isn't like you have to go off to the desert or something. It starts in the small things of your life. And I've noticed in the last couple of years, a lot of things have changed for me of what I care about, what I don't care about, all these things that have just fallen away from my life because they're not important anymore. And it's not hard to let go of them. They just fall away because I don't care about them anymore.
Right.
But I think that's the way. I guess I want to also say, like, it's not like you're trying to say, look at me, I'm so great. You're just saying that you are that way, but it's because you've chosen to live this kind of life from a fairly, from the beginning of your adulthood, basically.
Yeah, there's also, even before I really studied any serious philosophy, there was a rational calculation there that it's better to have time and freedom than to weigh oneself down with ephemeral material things. Even though I'm a human, and for example, I do like eating out in restaurants and enjoying meals and so, but also at a fundamental level, I could just as well eat, oatmeal and peaches.
Right.
And I would just accept that for what it is. It's
Right.
nourishment, it's food, but I wouldn't have an emotional reaction to having to live on oatmeal and peaches.
Right. Like you appreciate the culinary and the pleasure of food and the aesthetic value of it as a culinary art, but at the same time, unlike perhaps some people where their whole life is based on pleasure, taking that away, even though you appreciate it, you're fine without it because it's not the basis of your life. It's just a nice bonus every once in a while.
It's also consciously, I don't regard material things as necessary for mental well-being. And that's coming more from Stoic training, where the only good is virtue, which is self-control and assenting to reality. I don't want to go off topic too much, but basically what that means is that anything external to the mind, you should be indifferent to. Now, you can still sit and enjoy a glass of wine and you can enjoy material things, but you should not consider that something worth pursuing or orienting your life toward. So, I mean, this would sort of basically...
I think this is basically what he's saying too.
Yeah, it's not saying like...
This is a point where the two schools really intersect.
Definitely. This is basically an ethical issue of how do you want to orient your life? Do you want to orient your life towards acquiring or being manipulated by material things, and also the social interactions which inevitably result from desire for material things, collective desire for material things? Like, for example...
But I think you said something when you started explaining further why it doesn't really affect you if you were to lose these things. You said it's because you don't think it's the basis of a good life.
Mental well-being.
Exactly. So my previous example, where there are people who like basically their whole life goal fundamentally boils down to a bunch of hedonistic things. Mm-hmm. Those people, I believe, actually think that whether they will, but like subconsciously at least, they believe that all those hedonistic things are the source of mental well-being. And that's why they have a mental breakdown when when all of that's taken away and there's nothing left, because they haven't pursued anything else or developed the self to any degree, because they've only focused on these externalities, believing them to be the source of mental well-being.
Well, I'll give you an example of this, not speaking of anybody in particular, but downward social mobility is emotionally and psychologically crippling for many people. And by downward social mobility, I mean where you don't have as much money as you used to. So, for example, the person who used to drive, a $150,000 car, having to drive, a $10,000 used beater, is going to experience a sort of cognitive dissonance, perhaps, but they're basically going to suffer, even though they still have a car which gets them around and gets them to work or to the grocery store.
I think there's a deeper aspect there that still ties to this. And it's not just about the physical thing they have, but it's the social status. And it is their identity, because I think like going back to psychology, or I guess more like depth psychology of Jung, like the ego, the idea of the self that we have is not the true self often, right? That our true self is the soul in us, which is part of everything. But people think that their persona is their self, right? Often. So this person is, or he or she is also suffering, not because of the actual aesthetic and technical merit of the vehicle, but their own perception of their own self-worth and how they think they're being perceived because they're driving this thing now, right? And that's because they think that their self-worth or that their identity is tied to all these externalities, and that all these things that they've assembled into this play act of the self is themselves. But it is not the true self. The true self is inward and unrelated to any of this. But I think that it is something that very few people even ever acknowledge, let alone embrace. It is a hard thing to embrace. I can't say that I have necessarily embraced it. I don't think any of us fully embrace it 100% all of the time. Can't.
Well, what you were saying just brought to mind an example of where, self-image can change based on the social context. Now, for example, in most of North America, I would venture to say that a lot of middle and upper middle class people think that riding the bus is an indication of poverty, and they just wouldn't do it because
in America,
especially in America, but you would also find that in Canada because they view the bus as
America
basically
too.
Yeah, they view it.
I mean, the Americas, yes, the North America.
Yeah, they view the bus as basically a vehicle for poor people who can't afford a car, and so they would just avoid it like the plague. And you'll talk to people, they'll be like, "I haven't ridden a bus in 40 years." But those same people,
the transit situation of the America. Well, I think that's where you're getting at, but this is more about the politics of transit in America versus, for example, Europe.
But this is my point, where then if you take that same person and they're on vacation in Italy and they want to go to the beach, they have no problems taking the bus.
Right.
Because suddenly it's in a foreign country and the context is different, and they don't feel like their self-worth or their dignity is being insulted by having to take the bus.
Because it has a different social meaning in that country than it does in the US or Canada.
So the buses could be identical, but the social context determine something.
We are
very
social
different.
Animals, much of the evolved human. I think that's a major part of why we are humans, and
that's why actually this is an exercise that I've done.
All of these abstractions we've created for ourselves.
This is an exercise that I do sometimes, especially when I'm back in my native Canada, is I will actually walk through poor areas of the city, and I will just take in the fact that this is a very different environment than what I'm used to these days. I mean, I grew up, very working class, and so that sort of environment isn't alien to me by any means. But I've lived away from it for so long, and I mean, I live in academia, and generally the academic environment is an ivory tower, and arguably a lot of universities are basically upper middle class, even if the people involved are not economically upper middle class, but the institution itself is upper middle class. So you're not really exposed usually directly to the ills of society. And so it's a good reminder to oneself of just how different even your own local society can be,
right,
to see this, but also to put yourself into that position where maybe you actually do feel uncomfortable. And then you have to look internally and wonder, well, why do I feel uncomfortable? And even you could even say, oh, well, I feel unsafe in this neighborhood because I think that there's crime here. But you have to ask yourself why. So it's basically, my point is that you basically can also challenge yourself and put yourself into different circumstances and have different experiences, and then internally evaluate why you're having the reactions that you're having, especially if they are unstable or strong emotional reactions, negative emotional reactions.
Absolutely. And I think that is a different, like the example I gave earlier and this example, I think we're getting back to the same thing, that how do we put into practice these truths that Plotinus has presented, which is the illusion of the material. Constant self-questioning, constant contemplation, and it should come naturally. You need to just take time to think and be introspective in your life. Don't just react, and it needs to just become natural.
Well, also, like what Plotinus is ultimately saying too, is that if the soul is shaken, that it's your fault. There's nothing external. It's entirely your own fault. So if your soul is shaken, you feel fear or dread or terror, or you're basically suffering mentally in any sort of way. He's basically saying it's all as a result of your perception. There's nothing inherent,
right?
Because the soul is ultimately unaffected by everything material. There is no,
and that no change is actually happening to the soul, which is really the true self.
Right. There's no change there. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like the chemical composition of water. You can throw mud in it, but the chemical composition of H2O remains pure.
Right.
You just have to clear out the mud, and then the H2O was always there. It's just there's a fogginess to it that you just have to eliminate.
So there were two other things I wanted to touch on. I think we've like pretty much captured the essence of this chapter, but there was a couple of things that he brings up that I wanted to bring up for the listener. The first one was I wanted to bring up the parts of the Timaeus that he, I guess, glosses on, where he talks about in the Timaeus, which basically explains the creation of the universe and matter and how things are, like basically the cosmology of reality by Plato. There's a section where basically a lot of this is just his interpretation or explanation of that. There's a part where he talks about matter as being a vessel or the mother, which is a reference to the passages in Plato.
Yes, 3:6:19.
Yeah.
3:6:19. The forms which actually enter the matter as their mother do it no harm or good. Yes.
Right. And I think most of that is in Timaeus 50, 49, that area. And then the father, I think, is really he's talking about that would be being, because in ancient Greece, they believed that women actually had that, like, babies were not really genetically tied to the mother, which of course is incorrect. They thought that women were that the womb was just a vessel, and that all of the life force and all of the genetic, they didn't call it that, but that everything that is the kid is actually the father, which explains a lot about why patriarchy in the Greco-Roman world was as it is. It's just men's fear of death, but that's a whole different topic. So I guess I just want to connect this for people that if you're reading Plato, this is a good further extrapolation of some of those concepts and how you can see them as real things in the universe, that this father is the being, the mother is matter, and the child would actually be the resulting bodies, which he says, like, since matter on its own is nothing, bodies, everything we perceive that is actually something, even though they're illusory, they still, it's kind of weird because, like, they're illusory, but they're still more real than the matter because of the illumination from being. So you and I, so all things that are animate, I guess, would be the resulting child of this vessel. And he also specifies that even though he uses the term vessel, it is not truly like a vessel, because it's not like being is poured into matter. They never actually physically interact. It's more like, he says, the mirror that is just like reflected on or projected onto it. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up, since he talks about how everything we perceive is an illusion, and that he brings up that matter is nothing and is not visible because it has neither color nor magnitude. He spends a little bit of time talking about the concept of magnitude, and that magnitude is a form, and the idea of size, and that size is the sizes we see in things when we're perceiving things in the visible universe are not real. And in the book, it also says that the Greek term that he's using for size could also be interpreted as largeness, and therefore that it might be insinuating that the largeness of true magnitude when projected into the visible universe is small. I don't know if you had any thoughts about this whole section. I thought it was a little confusing. I know it's much more about, like, it's basically like ancient optics and ancient physics to some degree, but he did take time to talk about it at length and like an entire section.
Right.
If you could better explain some of this, because I don't know that I fully grasped, I guess, what he meant by size or how the two interrelate.
Like, for example, if you see a culmination of what you perceive, or what you perceive to be a culmination of matter, such as, for example, a mountain, you take the mountain as a singular object made of matter, and then the magnitude of that mountain is perceived to be much larger than the person who's observing it, right? If you put a pebble next to, a mountain on the horizon, obviously the mountain appears so much larger. And so that's an example of magnitude. But then magnitude itself is also a form because it's something that you perceive.
Right, but he's saying that magnitude doesn't really exist in the visible universe, that we just have size.
You have largeness. Yeah, you have the concept of largeness. But then if largeness is a concept of something that's non-existent, then again, it's basically also measuring something that doesn't really exist. So for example, we think of the mountain as something made of matter, but really the magnitude or the largeness of the mountain is a scale or measurement that we're using for something that does not exist.
So I guess, are you saying that size is just the image or the corruption of true magnitude that is a form?
It's an image, yeah. It's a reflection
Yeah, okay.
of a form. I mean, we'll go into this in the next chapter when it talks about eternity, but time is also a form as well.
Okay, right. So I guess he's just applying this in the same way anything else that's visible, because we need to have size.
Mm-hmm.
To see things, you need to have a couple of things. You need to have, the light spectrum to be able to visibly see things, but things also have to have some sort of dimension.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess, yeah, it doesn't really have any further ethical implication. It's just part of the structure of the logic he's presenting.
Right. It's his metaphysics, or his understanding of the world.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because people may get to that point and be like, I would be confused. I mean, we're like, why is this even here?
Right.
But I think it's just like he's just part of the building blocks for him to explain how matter works and how the visible universe works to make his bigger point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Good.
So I hope that everybody next time they feel the need to do retail therapy, maybe think twice, save a couple of dollars, and orient themselves toward the good.
Right. So next time we'll talk about eternity and time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.